Well, let's return to our top story now. The corruption investigation released today that I've outlined at the start of the show. The Australian newspaper's Rachel Baxendale joins me now. Thank you so much for your time, Rachel. Look, the acting IBAC Commissioner,
Thanks for having me, Sharri.
Stephen Farrow said that he will be handing over evidence to prosecutors, so it does look like there could be charges. There were no adverse findings made against the Premier, but he didn't escape criticism. I think one of the key findings today is that IBAC actually took the word of a lobbyist and property developer that was recorded in a secret phone tap rather than the Premier's version of events when he said he couldn't recall that conversation, but that the nature of it didn't ring true.
Indeed, that's very true. There was this conversation at a fundraiser between long-term Labor lobbyist who Daniel Andrews admitted in evidence to IBAC he's known for over 20 years, Phil Steindl, and the Premier. And IBAC has said that they essentially accept the tenor of that conversation, and it was a very interesting conversation. Among other things, Phil Steindl reported back to his boss, essentially at the time, the property developer John Woodman, that the Premier had described Royce Miller, the Sunday Age journalist, as an arsehole. As a result of the fact that Royce Miller was pursuing a story which essentially kicked off this IBAC investigation about John Woodman's relationship with councillors out in Casey Council and also with the highest levels of the Andrews government. And there was also a conversation, Phil Steindl's recollection of the conversation is that Daniel Andrews asked him for John Woodman's number. Daniel Andrews is saying as recently as this afternoon that he can't remember whether he did or didn't.
It's extraordinary, and also part of that phone tap that apparently the Premier had said at the fundraiser that, you know, to pass on an apology for one of their planning projects not getting approval and it being deferred because of these allegations. And
indeed, and essentially blaming Royce Miller for the fact that that had been delayed, according to Phil Steindl, and in evidence that IBAC has largely accepted.
Now, there was another really fascinating part to this, which is that, you know, the culture that ultimately, and Damon Johnston mounts this argument, this culture that ultimately, with Daniel Andrews being in charge of Labor for the past 14 or so years, that he's created, he's thrived in, and that it is, you know, this culture where this cash for access happened. Can you talk to me how this is so problematic for Daniel Andrews?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the phrases that really stood out to me in the IBAC report was ministerial speed dating. There's this reference, there's this quote from the person who at the time was running the Labor's fundraising vehicle, which was known as Progressive Business, who was talking about how basically that organisation's events were all ministerial speed dating events, that they could, and that if Daniel Andrews or Treasurer Tim Pallas were at these events, they could charge attendees up to $5,000 a head. We, of course, had the famous flower drum lunch that Daniel Andrews attended with John Woodman, John Woodman's son, and two lobbyists, including Phil Steindl, for which John Woodman bid $10,000. I mean, it was essentially the Premier's time was being sold to someone who had very clear and very obvious interests in swaying the decisions of government at the highest level.
And that's why it is being called cash for access and privileged access. Rachel Baxendale, thank you very much.
Yeah, indeed.
For your reporting on this. And
thanks for having me, Sharri.